Welcome back. In our last lecture, I posed the question, why was it that Hellenism did not make more inroads into the Western Mediterranean? And we supplied a couple of answers to this, seeing that, of course, the early thrust of Hellenism had followed Alexander's conquests and had necessarily then been directed towards the east, towards the old Persian Empire. We then also looked at the career of Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, who I argued was the one Hellenistic ruler, the one successor of Alexander, who had a real shot at introducing Hellenism to the West politically. That is to say, he campaigned in southern Italy for about 6 years in the 270s, and had he been victorious, here we'll play for a moment what if, had he been victorious, I think that we would have seen a very different history of Rome, because Rome would have become integrated into a Hellenistic kingdom that would have embraced southern Italy, the Adriatic and Epirus. But that was not to be. The Romans were victorious, and though we saw that in the career of Pyrrhus we were able to understand how he was interested in just further expansion for its own sake, we went over the story of Cineas, the philosopher, interviewing Pyrrhus, and we saw that Pyrrhus was very much like the other Hellenistic rulers and like Philip. We found that his failure meant that politically the tide had turned. And yet we tried to temper this picture somewhat by seeing that while politically no Hellenistic state was able to dominate Rome and the Italian peninsula, nevertheless, culturally, Rome had begun to come under the influence of Hellenism. And we saw this being precipitated by the influx not only of Greek goods, of property, of statues, of temples, of artwork and so forth into Rome, but also even of human beings. People being brought to Rome as captives and as slaves. And we saw that these people coming from the wider Hellenistic world of the Eastern Mediterranean brought with them Greek culture. And the best example of this, of course, was Livius Andronicus, who actually translated Homer and Greek tragedies, essentially, into Latin. This really sets the stage for what is going to be a complicated story involving the relationship between Rome and the Greeks. Because the political end of Hellenism, the incorporation of these Hellenistic kingdoms into the emerging world empire of the Romans, will mean the end of an independent Hellenistic world or Hellenistic kingdoms. And it raises some serious questions. How was Rome, a small town originally just on the Tiber River, able to exert the kind of control that no king since Alexander had wielded? And by what stages did Rome come to conquer the Greeks? These are vexed questions because in the past some have wanted to argue that there was a fixed plan of world conquest that lay behind the relationship between Rome and the Greeks, as if the Romans, after conquering the Italian peninsula, simply went further afield, endlessly looking for more regions to conquer. But we may find that there will be other factors involved here. And so what we need to turn to is the fuller story of Rome's interaction with the Hellenistic East and Rome's growth to world power. After Rome's first serious contact with a Hellenistic ruler, Pyrrhus of Epirus in the 270s, Rome had little time to deal with the major Hellenistic kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is because Rome, on the western side of the Italian peninsula, faced an even greater superpower in the Western Mediterranean, and that was, of course, Carthage. So the 3rd century BC, though it does see the contact between Rome and Pyrrhus, is really a century that is much more taken up in the Western Mediterranean with the wars between Carthage and Rome. During this century, the Romans fought two serious engagements against Carthage, two serious wars, and both these wars witnessed developments in Rome's approach to warfare and territorial expansion that would set the stage for the Roman expansion east, which would take place then in the 2nd century BC. Now, the first of these great contests between Rome and the Carthaginians was the First Punic War. It takes its name from the fact that the Romans referred to the Carthaginians as Punii because they were Phoenicians. Remember, they'd been colonized by the Phoenicians. And this First Punic War lasted from 264 BC to 241 BC. A long, drawn-out campaign which came after Rome had united virtually all of the Italian peninsula under its control. I'm not going to go into the details of the First Punic War, but there are certain features of it that I need to highlight because they will have a real impact on the future development of Rome. The first is that the First Punic War saw the emergence of Rome as a maritime power. Up until now, virtually all of Rome's campaigns and conquests and territorial expansion had taken place on the Italian peninsula. But in the First Punic War, the Romans built fleets that successfully engaged the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians, of course, were a great naval power, long used to sailing the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean. And at the sea battles of Mylae and Cape Ecnomus, the Romans proved to be their equal in battle on water as on land. And that, of course, would be an ominous development for Rome's future expansion. Probably even more importantly than the fact that the war had moved from land to sea was that in the First Punic War, the Romans demonstrated their ability to win a war of attrition. This war lasted for well over 20 years, and in it they fought a tough and wealthy adversary, a major economic force in the Western Mediterranean that could afford to pay for mercenary armies. And yet every year the Roman levies once again collected, bringing men from the Italian peninsula ready to fight on behalf of Rome. And every year, fresh Roman armies went into the field. There is something inexorable about this, which is distinctively Roman. And the third feature of the First Punic War that I wish to highlight is that the war saw the Romans amassing a huge amount of booty, including their first overseas province, Sicily, which was acquired as a result of the victory. So by the middle of the 3rd century BC, we have a Rome which is undergoing a rapid expansion, which is moving out onto the water and becoming a naval power, the equal of Carthage, an empire that has already acquired a province beyond the Italian peninsula itself. The Second Punic War, towards the end of the century, would last from 218 BC to 202 BC, and once again it pitted the Romans against their Carthaginian enemies, provoked by differences between the Romans and the Carthaginians over a question of a Roman alliance. And this, in a way, is going to be typical of Rome's overseas engagements. The Romans enter into alliances and they take these seriously. In this case, the Roman alliance is with a Spanish town, the town of Saguntum, and there was a difference of opinion, finally leading to war between the Carthaginians and the Romans as to whether or not Saguntum lay within the Carthaginian sphere of influence or the Roman sphere of influence. We won't go into the details of how the war broke out, but the war is important because it will prefigure much of Rome's involvement in the Hellenistic East to come. In what senses? Well, first of all, historians are used to looking, of course, for the economic causes for a war. But there is, in fact, little evidence to suggest that the Romans responded to such pressures as competition over natural resources. It is not very likely that the Romans went to war with Carthage because they were competing to get the resources of Spain. The reason they went to war is because the Romans took their alliance with Saguntum seriously, alliances which bound the Romans to smaller and weaker states. The basis of this was what the Romans called friendship, amicitia, and the Romans did not protect a state to whom they were allied. In their eyes, it meant that they had not demonstrated and proved their good faith. These are binding concepts in Roman law. The other feature of the war that I think is very interesting is that the Second Punic War involved, of course, that most charismatic of generals from the ancient world, Hannibal. Hannibal, a Carthaginian commander who in many ways resembles Alexander the Great. Rather than sail across the short stretch of water leading to Sicily and the Italian peninsula, instead, in the good style of Alexander, he marched his army up through Spain and across southern France and over the Alps and into Italy, performing a great journey, a heroic journey worthy of Alexander. And he, in fact, saw the Romans, I think, in much the same way as Alexander saw the Persians. The war would end with a Roman victory at Zama, just outside of Carthage, in 202 BC, and it would coincide with Rome's emergence as a state that in some ways resembled other Hellenistic states, but in other ways was quite different from it. And I want to highlight both the similarities and the differences that we see in the Second Punic War. First of all, unlike most of the Hellenistic kingdoms that we've seen, which relied heavily on mercenary armies, the Romans had extended the franchise. They had given citizenship to many of the people of the Italian peninsula. They in fact had a very elaborate system of citizenship. Some people were made Roman citizens, some people were made Latin citizens, which was a kind of second status. But the point was that by enfranchising so many people outside of the city of Rome itself, they had dramatically increased the manpower available for the Roman army. So while Hannibal was fighting with mercenary forces and forces culled from different parts of the Carthaginian Empire of the Western Mediterranean, the Romans were able to bring into battle the men of the Italian peninsula. And the numbers are really quite disparate. Polybius reports that the Romans were able to muster over 700,000 men at the time when Hannibal crossed the Alps into Italy with an army of 90,000 men. So while Hannibal's crossing of the Alps lives on in memory as a great event, in fact, the army that he was coming up against was potentially vastly larger than any of the forces he'd brought with him. This was to have a concrete effect, because in the early stages of the Second Punic War, Hannibal was extraordinarily successful year after year, but could never defeat Rome. At the Battle of Trebia, at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, and at the Battle of Cannae, 3 years in succession, the Romans suffered the kinds of military defeats that would have destroyed any Hellenistic kingdom. At the Battle of Cannae alone, up to 25,000 Roman soldiers may have perished in one day. It may have been the single most bloody day of fighting in European history ever. 25,000 men. Now, we've seen that great kings like Antiochus III of Syria, if defeated once by the Romans, as at Magnesia in 189, were forced to make astonishing reparations, paying indemnities of thousands of talents and signing humiliating peace treaties, giving up vast tracts of their territory. The Romans' response to these terrible defeats was simply to put more men into the field, ever larger armies. Not only that, after they were defeated in these 3 great battles, the Romans went on to hold out against Hannibal in Italy for 14 years, and at the same time to open up new fronts campaigning against the Carthaginian forces in Sicily and in Spain, before finally, in 204 BC, being able to send a Roman army by fleet to North Africa, and forcing Hannibal, of course, to return and eventually defeating him on his own front doorstep. So the resources available to the Romans in sheer manpower dwarfed anything that the Hellenistic kingdoms were able to put into the field. That is to say, not in necessarily one single battle, but certainly in the long term, year after year. And that's where the Romans were well prepared for their dealings with the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the Greeks in antiquity well understood that there was something different about the Romans. They were also stunned by the eventual success of the Romans in overtaking their own world, and they had an explanation for it, but it was a little different from the one I've just been offering of manpower. Polybius, the Greek historian writing in the 2nd century BC, he actually lived in Rome because he ended up going there as a hostage, and so he knew the Greek system and he knew the Roman system very well. As an astute politician and as an historian and as someone trained in all the traditional practices of Greek philosophy, he argued that the success of the Romans was due to their constitution. Now, constitutional theory was something that was well developed and advanced by the time of the 2nd century. And the view in the Greek world, in the Greek intelligentsia, the view that had been worked out was that there were essentially 6 types of constitution. 3 good and 3 bad. The types of constitutions involved the rule of a single man, secondly, the rule of a small elite, and thirdly, the rule of a large number of people. The good version of the first, of course, was kingship, which was then debased into tyranny. The good version of the second was aristocracy, which when debased turned into oligarchy. The good version of the third was democracy, which when debased turned into mob rule. So there is a well-packaged intellectual program, if you will, already in place in the Greek world for understanding Rome's success. Well, understanding constitutions and then interpreting Rome's success in those terms. What did the Greeks make of this? Well, it's simply this. For Polybius and for other Greeks, the Romans represented a kind of perfect balance of these different types of constitutions. So, unlike the Hellenistic East, which was dominated by great kings such as Ptolemy or Antiochus, unlike the regional federations of Greece, the Achaeans and the Aetolians, or the old Athenian democracy, the Romans, in their view, had a mixed constitution, blending each of the three elements that we've talked about. So, the principle of kingship was actually represented by the two consuls who shared power and were elected for a single year. This is brilliant because being elected every year, they're not kings for life, and because there's two of them, the power of one is always balanced by the second. So this seems to represent what we would call a check and a balance, if you will. Secondly, the oligarchic principle was represented by the power of the Senate. This was the body made up of ex-magistrates, so it wasn't open just to anybody. You had to be someone who'd served the state. And they came to dominate foreign policy. The decrees that were sent out from Rome usually began a decree of the Senate and people of Rome. We're familiar with that catch phrase, Senatus Populusque Romanus. And then the democratic principle, which for the Greeks meant, the assemblies of the whole population of voting citizens, was represented at Rome by voting assemblies. Laws were ratified by the popular vote of the people and by the public meetings of the Roman populace. These raucous public meetings known as contios, where speakers would stand up to debate about current issues of the day. And so, in the eyes of Polybius, the Romans had found a way of managing to blend all of these together. And so he says in his essay, this is in his essay on the Roman Constitution in Book 6 of his work, Polybius says, as for the Roman Constitution, it had three elements, each of them possessing sovereign power, and their respective share of power in the whole state had been regulated with such a scrupulous regard to equality and equilibrium, checks and balances, equality and equilibrium, that no one could say for certain, not even a native, whether the constitution as a whole, was an aristocracy or a democracy or a despotism. And no wonder. For if we confine our observation to the power of the consuls, we should be inclined to say it was rather despotic. If, on the other hand, the Senate, as aristocratic, and if finally one looks at the power possessed by the people, it would seem to be a clear case of democracy. So the Romans seem to blend these various elements. Now, the effect of this, it was not merely a theory that there were different types of constitutions that fascinated the Greeks. They also believed that in these various constitutions lay the seeds of revolution and war. That good rule was always going into its debased form, so kingship was always turning into despotism. And this was then precipitating war that led to aristocracy and then breaking down into oligarchy. So this was not merely 6 different constitutions, it was a cycle of conflict and civil breakdown. By creating a mixed constitution, in the eyes of the Greeks, what the Romans had done was to break the cycle, to create a kind of perfect constitution where all elements were in perfect harmony. And so Polybius says, the result of this power of the several estates, the 3 different groups, for mutual help or harm, is a union sufficiently firm for all emergencies. For whenever any danger from without compels them to unite and work together, the strength which is developed by the state is so extraordinary that everything required is unfailingly carried out by the eager rivalry shown by all classes to devote their whole minds to the need of the hour and to secure that any determination come to should not fail for want of promptitude. Now, we might be inclined to dismiss this purely as theorizing by a professor of Greek philosophy or a theoretician. But we must remember the man who wrote this lived in Rome. He saw the system working in Rome. And so even though he's using the Greek apparatus for explaining the Romans, I think we have to credit him with having some insight into the way that the Romans were successful. They managed to have power devolved into different institutions and areas balancing each other. Nevertheless, it would be naive to buy this entire interpretation. And the fact is, and Polybius doesn't give us all the details of this, but the fact is that in the 3rd century, an aristocracy was emerging in Rome that would come to dominate Roman policy towards the east. Power in Rome was held by a small coterie of families. For example, in about 100 years of what historians call the Middle Republic, say the 3rd and 2nd century, 50% of the consulships, 50% of the magistrates of Rome came from 8 families. So there is a very narrow aristocracy here. And the scions of these families, the young men coming to the fore, making their reputations, felt an enormous pressure to wage war and to win glory for their families and for Rome. And so it was that men like the Fabii and the Scipios came to see overseas campaigns as their duty and as an expression of Rome's good faith towards its allies. So personal ambition and state policy married perfectly. Now, with the defeat of Hannibal and the Carthaginians, the Romans were now drawn more comprehensively into the eastern Mediterranean. Rome's first eastern involvement had been involving, once again, the pirates, those ubiquitous pirates we've spoken of so often. And there was a pirate stronghold in the kingdom of Illyria in the vicinity of what is modern-day Albania, Montenegro and Croatia, the eastern side of the Adriatic. The Romans intervened to put an end to piracy here in 229 and 219, although both of these campaigns ended with treaties rather than military campaigns. So we see the Romans still a little wary about moving east. Rome became more directly involved in eastern affairs, in the affairs of the Greeks to the east, as a result of the war with Hannibal, because Hannibal was allied with the king of Macedon, Philip V. So, to keep Philip out of the war so that they could concentrate purely on Hannibal, the Romans formed an alliance of their own with the people of Aetolia, of northwestern Greece. And this Roman-Aetolian alliance, designed to keep Philip out of the war, was joined by King Attalus of Pergamum. So as a result of a war in Italy, the Romans form alliances with various Greek and Hellenistic states. This first war, taking the Romans into the eastern Mediterranean, is the First Macedonian War, which lasted from 214 to 205 BC. And if you remember the dates of Hannibal's invasions, you'll see that that war corresponds entirely with the time when Hannibal was in Italy. So while the Romans were nominally at war with Philip, they really were involved in no major battles at the time. They eventually concluded a peace with Philip of Macedon, Philip V, in 205, the so-called Peace of Phoinike. And this freed the Romans to concentrate on Hannibal and affairs in the Italian peninsula. But the war, even though it had no military impact at all on Rome's involvement in the East, it did result in Rome's first major alliances in the Greek world, the Kingdom of Pergamum and the Aetolians. So in the short term, Rome had a very minuscule involvement in Greek affairs at this time, and then withdrew, but it had set the stage for a much more comprehensive involvement now in the 2nd century. Once Hannibal had been defeated, the Romans were once again free to turn their attention to Philip V and affairs in the Greek world and the eastern Mediterranean. This came to a head in the Second Macedonian War, fought between 199 and 196 BC. And the details of this illustrate the complexity of Rome's emerging role as a Hellenistic superpower. The war was caused by a series of factors. One was Roman resentment at the fact that Philip V had made an alliance with Hannibal during the invasion of Italy. Since Hannibal was their enemy, Philip V was their enemy, and it was payback time, let's put it that simply. A second factor was the threat to Rome's new allies, Pergamum and Rhodes, from an alliance between Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III of Syria. What we're finding here, quite simply, is that there is a shifting series of alliances involving the states of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hellenistic kingdoms and the powerful trading ports and so forth, and Rome is being sucked into this, thanks to its alliances, not seeking to acquire an empire, but being drawn in to the complex diplomatic world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, according to one interpretation of these events, Rome had now taken on the role as power broker in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Rome was intervening to break up a powerful alliance of Macedon and the Seleucid dynasty. In this view, Rome was using its amicitia, its friendship, with its allies, such as Rhodes and Pergamum, as just a pretext. That really what it was after was breaking the power of the Seleucids and of Macedon. And in this interpretation, the person who is usually most blamed is the succession, or the people who are most blamed are the successive Roman commanders, particularly Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a flamboyant commander who is supposed to have sought lucrative military commands, impressive military commands in the East. The Hannibalic War is over, there's no glory to be had there, so the argument goes, these Roman generals are pushing for war out in the East so that they can get a chance to go out on campaign, to make a name for themselves and to win their booty. Now, there may be some truth to these charges, that the Romans were forcing the war, both for private and for public reasons. But there is a danger in this interpretation that we may see a Roman plan for world conquest when there are actually much more simple explanations which apply. The Romans were successful in the war, the Second Macedonian War from 199 to 196. They defeated Philip's Macedonian phalanx at the Battle of Kynoskephalae. The Battle of the Dog's Head is what it means in English, in 197. And this was the first victory of a Roman legion over a Macedonian phalanx. Not the forces of Pyrrhus, of Epirus, but a Macedonian phalanx in a pitched battle. But the aftermath of the war is what I think is most instructive. Let's examine what happens after the Roman victory to see if we can understand Rome's aims before the war. Well, in a widely celebrated festival held at the Isthmus of Corinth, the Roman general Flamininus, this supposed warmonger, declared the freedom of the Greeks in an event which absolutely stunned the Greek world. I want to read you a description of this because it's quite amazing. The expectation of what would happen at the Isthmus drew the men of highest rank from nearly every quarter of the world, meaning every quarter of the Greek world. And there was a great deal of talk on the subject from one end of the assembled multitude to the other. What are the Romans going to do? They've defeated Philip. The whole of the Greek world, or at least of mainland Greece and Macedon, is in their hands. What are they going to do? Some said that from certain of the places and towns it was impossible that the Romans could withdraw. The Romans are going to leave their garrisons here. Of course they are. Others asserted that they would withdraw from those considered most important, but would retain others that were less prominent, though capable of being quite as serviceable. So people are going on saying the Romans are going to stay, the Romans are going to go, the Romans are conquering, whatever. And this is what happens. In the middle of this hubbub, the herald comes out, blows his trumpet, and when there's silence, he delivers the following proclamation. The Senate of Rome and Titus Quinctius, proconsul and imperator, have conquered King Philip and the Macedonians in war. And they declared the following peoples free, without garrison, or tribute, in full enjoyment of the laws of their respective countries, namely Corinthians, Phocians, Locrians, Euboeans, Achaeans, and so forth. And they start to list off all the people of Greece. And there is an absolute outcry as people cannot believe that the Romans are seriously saying, we've conquered Philip, now you're free. And of course there were many who claimed that the Romans really didn't mean this at all. But in fact, consider these factors. The Macedonians had maintained control of Greece thanks to the use of three key garrisons known as the fetters of Greece. The Romans now took over these as a result of their victory over Philip V of Macedon, and what did they do? The Senate sent orders to Flamininus to quit the garrisons and to leave them alone. And then this I think is really the most important point. The freedom of the Greeks was declared in 196 BC. By 194 BC, there was not a single Roman soldier on the Greek mainland. The Romans did not have a long-term plan for the Roman domination of Greece. Rome would be sucked in by its eastern alliances, and it would be these conditions that would lead to the final incorporation of the Hellenistic East into Rome's emerging empire.